Okay, so one of the most valuable lessons we've all learnt in this pandemic has been the value of communications, whether that's in our organizations, with how we're talking to our people about the pandemic and the position it's putting upon their lives, or whether it's governments talking to individuals in society about how they should live their lives. It's become such a more important topic. But it's not just because of the pandemic. Communications is now so important to every aspect of leadership because of the age in which we live, and that of course is the highly developed information age, which is more participative and more dynamic than it ever has been before. And I've always wanted to model how information behaves in the new environment, and I came across a thing called the Gartner hype cycle, which I think exactly measures the way information is processed by audiences in the modern world. And what Gartner say is, actually, with a piece of technology comes onto the market, I'm saying it's exactly the same for a piece of communication. That piece of communication will initially reach a very high level of hype. Gartner call this a peak of inflated expectation. It will then be taken down to what they call a trough of disillusionment, and then eventually rise up again to a plateau of performance. And what they're saying there, if you apply it to the information world, is that you will get a message. It will immediately have rumor and misinformation attached to it. So you'll end up at the top of this information cycle here, where there's more hype than truth around. And so the natural reaction, because we're human, is to take down that mistruth. And that's why it comes down here to a trough of disillusionment. And it's only when the advocacy builds afterwards that we find the truth coming out. But the key thing to note here is that the level of truth, the level of impact that's achieved by that piece of information is nowhere near as high after it reaches a plateau of performance than it has been at the peak of the hype. And of course, we don't just deal with one issue at a time. Every single issue that enters our minds, enters our ears, enters our world has a hype cycle attached to it. And what we have to do is figure out where we set the threshold of attention, where we and our organizations, if we're leaders, are going to pay the most attention, because that's how we have to communicate with them in the modern world. So of course, the other thing which I've already mentioned is the fact that we are now working in much more distributed organizations than we ever have. We're all getting comfortable with the hybrid work scenario, and we've created little organizations that may be a little bit more distant from the main organization, or we've connected other people that wouldn't normally be connected with each other. And so we're working in highly networked, highly compelling networks of people that will just interact with each other in different ways that we've seen before. So it's really important that we actually get communications absolutely right. Now, the communications industry defines communications as having three really key components. The first is content, and that is what is said, what leaders need to say, the actual words they say to their people. The second is reach, and that is a measure of how far the message is supposed to be broadcast. And the third is rhythm. You know, typically organizational protocols, organizational processes tend to deal with how far you want to get the message and how often you want to get the message out to the people that matter. That's why we have things like town halls, and we have things like policy documents and regular information communiques that go out. What I say nowadays is because we live in this world of the modern information environment where hype is so important, there has never been a stage in organizational history where content has been more important. And so the key to getting the message across to your people is to focus not just on rhythm and reach, in other words, how often and how far you get the message, but really think about the content of what you're saying, because at the end of the day, the success of your strategy will be dependent not just on what you want to say, but on what your audiences need to hear.